In separate medical exams, two doctors reached the same conclusion. Joel Rifkin shows signs of a brain disorder. But what does Rifkin's brain, or the brain of any killer, actually look like? Today, advanced technology allows scientists to peer inside the minds of killers to see if a picture of their brain offers further insight to violent behavior.
In 1994, at the request of Joel Rifkin's attorney, doctors took a magnetic resonance image, an MRI, of Rifkin's brain. MRIs are static pictures that show what the brain looks like. They can reveal growths or lesions, physical abnormalities that can short-circuit the brain.
If you were anticipating the imaging of a violent person, what would you be looking for?
You want to make sure they don't have a tumor or a mass pressing on any portion of the brain, which could cause them to have behavioral changes. There are many reports people have masses, they have personality changes, they lose their patience.
Dr. Patricia Roach is a neuroradiologist at Stony Brook University Hospital in New York. She is a colleague of the doctor who originally evaluated Rifkin's brain scans.
What do you see in Joel Rifkin's MRI scan?
Basically, it's a very normal brain. Here we have select images, a coronal, what's called the T1 image. There are no abnormal bright spots in the brain tissue itself to signify a tumor or an infarction. So it's basically a very normal brain.
But even though the structure of Rifkin's brain appears normal, it still may not function properly. To find out, doctors at Stony Brook took an even more revealing image, one that showed Rifkin's brain literally in action. It's called functional brain imaging, SPECT and PET scans that show how hard different areas of the brain work.
Indirectly, you see function, not just structure.
I need you to hold perfectly still for me.
Advanced brain scans are basically color-coded maps that show how much energy individual parts of the brain use. Red indicates lots of activity.
Just 10 years ago, the question of what does the mind of a murderer look like is a question that was the province of pulp fiction or science fiction movies. Yet now it's reality, and it's been made a reality by scientific technical advances.
Dr. Adrian Rain has dedicated his career to studying the roots of violence. He is using brain scans to examine the frontal lobes of killers, the same area of the brain that Dr. Jonathan Pincus believes helps turn people violent.
We had a theory that the frontal region of the brain may be dysfunctional in violent offenders, functioning more poorly in murderers.
The theory that impulses are controlled by the frontal lobe dates back to 1848 to a railroad worker named Phineas Gage. An explosion sent this metal rod 3.5 feet long through his skull. It tore through Gage's brain, destroying the prefrontal cortex and leaving a gaping hole in his head. This is Gage's actual skull. Incredibly, he survived the accident, but it turned him into a mean and violent man.
That gave us the model that perhaps when we damage this part of the brain, this may lead to impulsive, aggressive behavior. And this is effectively what we found in our brain imaging study of the murderers.
In a landmark study at the University of Southern California, Dr. Rain scanned the brains of 41 convicted murderers and 41 nonviolent people after they concentrated on a series of numbers in a task known to stimulate the frontal lobe.
The task goes on for 32 minutes. It's a very boring task, but the prefrontal cortex is that part of the brain that's involved in maintaining attention, in vigilance. So we know that this psychological task activates that part of the brain that we thought is functioning poorly in murderers. It activates the prefrontal cortex.
Here is a scan from one of the normal brains. Everything looks symmetrical, and there is plenty of red in the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex, indicating healthy normal functioning in this region of the brain. This is a scan from one of the killer's brains. As a group, killers show almost no red, almost no activity in the prefrontal cortex. Rain says their impulse control center does not work properly.
So if you are to make me angry and I'm lacking prefrontal regulatory control, I'm more likely to get my knife out and stick it in you.
This is the scan of Joel Rifkin's brain, taken at Stony Brook back in 1994. Highlighted here, his prefrontal cortex. Doctors believed that Rifkin's frontal lobes showed regular activity. The hospital's final analysis? Normal.
We felt that the activity throughout the brain was acceptable and within normal limits.
For a second opinion, we took Rifkin's scan to Dr. Daniel Amen, an expert in evaluating the brain scans of killers. He came to a very different conclusion.
It shows significant abnormalities, especially in his prefrontal cortex, that part of his brain right toward the front. And we see it on multiple views in this SPECT scan.
Amen says there's too little red here and that it is not symmetrical, showing poor functioning in Rifkin's prefrontal cortex. That's part of the same area that Dr. Rain found dysfunctional in murderers, and that Dr. Bolton and Dr. Pincus also found defective in Joel Rifkin's brain. Even Dr. Roach admits that Stony Brook's findings may not be accurate.
It's an interpretation. It's not an exact science, it's more of an art.
An art, she says, that is constantly evolving.
There may be more research in the past 5 years that has gone on.
Is there any explanation for why it would not have been interpreted the way you interpret it today?
When I go back and look at scans that we first started doing in 1990, when I'd looked at 20 of them or 50 of them or even 100 of them, I mean, now that I've looked at 7,000, I read them completely different. So I think it has to do with experience, how many people have you seen, how many scans have you read, and so on.
What do you see when you look at Joel Rifkin's brain scan?
Well, when I look at his brain, what I see is a brain that's vulnerable to violence.
What causes that vulnerability? Past studies have shown that killers are created by their environment, by poverty, abuse, and neglect. But today, scientists are finding that's not always the case.
There are some murderers who have a completely normal background history and then one day they snap.
To try to find out what causes the brain dysfunction in killers, Dr. Adrian Rain conducted a second, more ambitious study, looking at the family backgrounds of killers. He divided the killers into two groups, those from bad homes who suffered physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, and those from good homes with no abuse. Remarkably, almost all of the killers from good homes, those who had suffered no abuse, had less activity, less red in the prefrontal cortex than killers who were abused.
If you're a violent offender and you come from a good home background, then the explanation of your violence may lie less in terms of your environment, which is quite benign and good, and the explanation may likely more lie in brain dysfunction. And that's exactly what we found.
Rain looked at a variety of possible explanations, including head injuries, tumors or lesions, and mental illness. He found none of these could account for the dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex. That led him to a stunning conclusion.
It's quite conceivable that the cause of the brain dysfunction in these murderers is not due to the environment. It may be due to genetics.
Rain admits it's hard to accept a genetic basis for violence.
Society has always resisted the notion that there's a biological and brain basis to violent behavior, to murder.
What if every test that could be done is done? And there's not a thing wrong with your brain?
Then that's who I am. But in the meantime, we can keep looking.